Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're talking about self-care. And I know this is a topic that a lot of people are talking about these days. This idea of you might be doing things for other people, you might be going through your life and you might be busy. Maybe you're in a career track where you're working insane hours, you're getting home late, you're leaving early in the morning. You know, you've got kids maybe, you've got friends and all these social obligations. And it seems like sometimes at the bottom of the list is taking care of ourselves, physically taking care of ourselves, taking care of our personal growth goals or needs, taking care of our emotional or mental state, finding time to meditate, for example, whatever that might be, whatever self-care means for you. Often it seems like it ends up on the bottom of the list. And Antonia and I were talking right before we started recording this show about this idea. And I kind of had a devil's advocate thing. I always have this devil's advocate frame I come from. And I said, we talk a lot about self-care in a lot of the circles we're in, and I hear this come up a lot. And yet when I'm out and about hanging out with friends and people that I know, especially people that are younger, it feels like that's not a challenge. I might be out at a restaurant, for example, with some friends, and maybe somebody in their late 20s, early 30s is there, and it feels like people around me seem to ask for what they want. They seem to ask very specific things on a menu. They seem to ask for the time they need. I've noticed that the workplace is shifting. I get a lot of stories from managers and business owners that their employees and the people that work with them on the team, if they need to go to a doctor's appointment, it's not like, oh, I got to take time. They just directly ask for the things they need in life, and they're not shy about asking for those things. So it's really interesting, and I thought we could talk a little bit about that and then also talk about what self-care is and maybe how you can apply some of the ideas we're going to talk about in this show to your life. Is it something that we need in life? Is it something that we have a deficiency of? Because when I look around, again, it looks and appears to be that all of us are starting to become more self-focused, not in a bad way, but definitely focused on getting the things that we want or need met in our life. So that's what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at this topic of self-care, not as necessarily the individual occurrences of it, but ultimately to see what the results are, like the end game of you asking for what you want or asking for what you need. Because like you mentioned, there seems to be a trend of making sure that people are very aware of what your personal preferences are and not being shy about them and saying what your personal preferences are and being confused when your personal preferences aren't necessarily honored. And then at the same time, the rhetoric around overwhelm or unhappiness or depression or in any of the anything that's not like an ideal life circumstance or a feeling around it, it's not like those are going away. It's not like suddenly we have an entire generation of people who are just infinitely happy because they finally learned the trick of asking for what they want.
Yeah.
And so if the end result is staying the same of asking for getting all your preferences met, as it was when people were shy about asking for their preferences and felt more like they had to be more homogenized in their, whatever the restaurant serves, that's what you get, right? Like in a time period where people didn't ask for what they wanted. If the result is the same, if we're not like actually increasing or leveling up in our happiness, then is what the newer generations are doing, is that actually self-care?
I think that word preference is really a key word right there. That's an interesting word because it speaks to, it creates a nuance between when you ask for what you want or quote unquote what you need, or you ask for a preference. That doesn't necessarily mean that's self-care related. And I think there's probably something to that word, the idea of a preference.
Yeah, because we actually had this conversation not too long ago about this idea of like putting your preference at a very high, not just something that is incidental, but actually like a value. Like you think your preferences are synonymous with ethics or values. And I think we've come to a time period in history where we're entering, I would say, an almost dangerously perceiver society. If we're looking at it through the model of personality types and pretending as if typology models could be applied to entire societies, right? Like in sort of a fractal way, then I think when you look back in previous generations or decades rather, there are certain decades that seem to be very typified as like judger time periods. I look back in the 50s and I see a very judger time period. Post-war, there's lots of resource, right? There's a time of abundance, but people pretty much dressed all the same and they individual expression was sort of discouraged, and minorities were treated very badly, and people were sort of like, that's what society told you to do, right? And then you've got this Nuremberg trial time period of like, well, those were my orders. It's sort of a very judger time period for at least a Western culture. But now I fast forward to this time period, and it seems like we're going all the way perceiver, right? Like, I'm a pepper, right? That's who I am. I have to express my individuality, and I want to be inclusive, but every single individual expression of humanity should be included. And we need to honor all of these individual expressions, and almost to a point where people start to make fun of the concept by calling, I almost wonder if like the judges are like, oh my God, perceivers, what's the problem? You're all special snowflakes, right? This idea of like, everybody's a special snowflake. And they say it in a derogatory way, because there's an almost oppressively perceiver ethos of everybody's individual expression and preferences should be honored equally. And I'm not putting a valuative statement on that. I'm not saying that the judger time period was better or that this perceiver time period is better. I think it's more like trends we go through as cultures, right? We sort of, the pendulum swings back and forth, and we go up the spiral, and according to spiral dynamics, and sometimes we're in a more sort of community-based time period, and sometimes we're in a more individual ego expression time period, and they both have their pluses and minuses. But that said, when we talk about self-care, are we talking about moving into a perceiver time period where you're making your preferences very known and thinking other people should honor all those preferences? Is that self-care? And is it asking for what you want versus asking for what you need? And what does it mean to ask for what you need? How do you define that? And again, I'm not necessarily seeing an uptick or swing in personal happiness during this time period. I'm seeing a generation, or at least a culture, that no longer will allow themselves to be oppressed. I'm seeing that. So I'm seeing a lot more conversation around power and maybe what empowerment means. I'm seeing those conversations, but I'm not necessarily seeing like happiness or fulfillment. And so I think self-care should be very well defined almost by its results. Mm-hmm. You'll know if you have mastered self-care because the emergent of that system of self-care, the emergent will be peace or happiness or fulfillment or joy or all the positive stuff that most of humanity is going toward.
By the way, if you're going, what did she mean by being a pepper, being unique? I think you're referring to here in the United States a Dr. Pepper commercial, a soda commercial, where it's this commercial where everybody gets to express their individuality. Weirdly enough, they're all kind of dressed similar and they're all drinking Dr. Pepper. So it's kind of a weird, like, express your individuality by all drinking the same thing. Anyway, that's what you're referring to, I'm assuming.
Thank you for explaining it to a broader audience.
Yeah, somebody's like, what is she talking about?
People who are watching American commercials.
Yeah. So I think the definition of self-care, let's unpack this a little bit. I think this is something I struggle with in my life. As a business owner, as somebody, we're creating a lot of content. I have children. We have a lot of family obligations. I would think that in our life, we have some people that I would classify as crazy makers, that we, their family or people that we are associated with, that we cannot be a part of the lives, like my ex-wife, for example. There's different people in our lives that kind of create chaos around us. And so we're always busy and moving and traveling and recording, and we're doing a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I've done is I've said, well, I'm going to go ahead and physically, emotionally, and mentally expend more energy doing all these things on behalf of legitimate things like the business or our family or whatever. And then I find myself burned out. I'll get to a place where we'll have been working really hard, during maybe a time period of creating a lot of cool stuff and family obligations, maybe around the holidays. And it starts to feel this pressure of, I'm exhausted and I haven't had alone time and I am tired and I can't focus anymore and I'm grumpy and I'm like you said, I'm unhappy. I can't find happiness right now because I'm so burned out from this. And we got a podcast to record the next day and we got this more stuff to do and it's late at night and I'm like, what do I do? And we've had lots of conversations offline about getting needs met, taking the time, not letting things stack until I'm overwhelmed and I can't handle it anymore. And I'm like ready to, on the verge of tears because I'm tired and we're burning ourselves out, building into our lives more of a routine of self-care where we take the time to do yoga in the morning, where we take the time. And as the business grows and this podcast grows and we get more successful and more people come into the tribe, there's more obligations. And so it feels like you would almost think the success would bring more time and opportunity the better we did things. And it's actually feeling like it's the reverse. It's more obligation. So we're having to do some adjustments in our personal lives. And so that's when we talk about self-care, to me, the idea of preference, because that's when I think about it on a surface level, that's what I think of. Like, you're taking care of yourself. You're asking for what you want. But really, I think self-care is managing the energy levels of yourself, whether that's emotional, mental, physical, or spiritual, or whatever, and attending to those in a pragmatic way, in a fashion that allows you to continue going throughout your life, giving your best self and creating the happiness you desire.
What's interesting in attempting to define self-care is that when you are the most burnt out, when you are the least resourced, that's when you become the fussiest about your preferences. Like, if we go to a restaurant and you ask for something very specific when you're burnt out, you will almost, you work it through, but you will almost be furious if you got your order wrong.
I don't have any space to like take bad things. And it's not even a bad thing. It's like a, it's first world problem, basically.
Yeah, well, but it's almost like a litmus test for you being under-resourced. And then when you are resourced, right, if you have your energy managed, energy levels managed, and you feel pretty good about life and everything's cool, if they get your order wrong, you're like, yeah, it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine.
Totally.
So the more fussy you are about your preferences, it's actually a sign that you are the least resourced. And so I think asking for your preferences I'm not necessarily demonizing that. We all have preferences, and it's good to get them honored, I think, to some extent, right? As long as you're not forcing your individual will as the top of, like, everybody should care about your preferences as much as you do. In a service industry setting where you're asking for specific kinds of food in a specific way, if the restaurant is set up to do that, if that's part of what they do, if it's not like fast food, but if it's, that's part of that tailored thing is part of what they advertise or what they're known for, or what they're good at, then that's part of the service that they've promised. So that's not a bad thing. And if you get really upset and irate that you didn't get your preference met, you might be overemphasizing the importance of your preference in that context where, and I think it might be a sign that maybe you're not getting your real needs met.
Do I get upset and irate that much? Am I like freaking out? I don't perceive myself as like yelling at anybody or like getting upset or irate.
Sorry, I changed the word you in my mind from a second person you to almost like a third person you. Like,
I'm willing to hear that feedback.
No.
I just was like, I'm like, whoa, is it that bad?
Or not a third person you. Sorry, I would still say second person you, but it stopped being you lowercase letters and turned into a you capital letters, like including an entire group of people. I'm more talking to the audience member right now as like a general statement about how that stuff works. So no, you're not a perpetually irate, restaurant customer, but when you have become upset, it is a sign that you are under-resourced. It's almost one of those things where, and I've noticed as you've done a lot of ego work, you'll catch yourself almost immediately doing it, and you'll try to figure out what's going on, what part of you is under-resourced, right? Why are you so emotionally attached to this? And I think you started to use it. My observation is you started to use it as like a red flag.
Yeah.
And that means needs are going unmet. So going back to the topic of what exactly does self-care look like, if it's not getting your preferences met and asking for what you want necessarily, it can be, but it's not necessarily that. And most of the time we talk about self-care, it ends up being conversations around get up and do yoga in the morning, or like make sure you're getting your bubble baths or time to yourself, or, like make sure that you are working out or something to that, like kind of more of the shallow conversation around what it can look like. I mean, that's not necessarily a shallow conversation, but it's more of like a surface, like these are examples of people engaging in self-care. But if we look at it in more of an abstract, as opposed to very specific, concrete examples of it, on the abstract level, like what does that mean to self-care? What does it mean to get your needs met? And I think the reason why it's so hard to talk about is because it is totally context dependent. It really depends on the individual peeling back the layers of what's going on for them and getting to a more subterranean level of what is at the heart of creating obstructions that are getting in the way of joy and fulfillment and peace and all of those other emotions that we're constantly chasing that end up emerging, not being chased. We can't chase peace, but we can create a system where peace is the emergent. So what self-care and getting your needs met means is not doing yoga in the morning, but rather asking yourself, where are you at in your life and what is truly going unmet? And why would yoga meet that? What is it about yoga that meets your needs? Is it that you are not very flexible and you're concerned about aging? You're concerned that the lack of flexibility in your body is going to cause future damage. So yoga attends to the need of your body becoming more flexible, and also your mind follows your body. So yoga isn't getting your need met. Becoming more flexible is getting your need met, because the need is a lack of flexibility. It's getting really good with your definitions and figuring out what's going on for you. So in a case of somebody demanding that their preferences be met, what's the actual need there? Is it a need of voice and expression? Is it a need to feel seen and validated? Is it a need to feel like you matter and are important and that other people are taking your interests into account? Is that the actual need? Because stating the preference isn't the need. It's the strategy for getting the need met. And really truly doing self-care means that you can't stay on the surface about this. You have to start peeling those layers back. You have to be very conscious and thoughtful about what the origin point of the need truly is.
I think that's a good point. And again, the reason we're talking about this today is, like you said, it's hard to get maybe peace directly. You can set up a system that gives you peace or happiness as the emergent. I think what we're actually after is this notion, and we're going to be talking about this over a couple podcasts here, this idea of personal empowerment. A lot of people, I think, in the world feel, even if they ask for what they want often, or it feels like they're going for meeting their needs, I sense around me a feeling of people that they don't feel empowered to be a part of the world and be able to speak up for their needs or wants or desires. And they feel like they might be dishonored if they do, or marginalized if they do. And there's this, a lot of conversation right now at the time of this recording around this idea that, are we empowered to speak up for what we want? And I think, we go into this idea of self-care. We talk about self-care, and I think it's a path. It's one of the paths to personal empowerment. There's others that we're going to talk about as well in other podcasts, but this is one of the keys. Fundamental is, are you getting the self-care you need? And I think, we go back to that thing we talked about at the very beginning, this idea of preference. And it seems like I'm around people that are like, it's the attitude like, I'm awesome. I'm a great person. I've got it dialed in. I'm going to ask for what I want. And like you said, when I do this, if I ask for my preferences and stuff and I get annoyed when they don't happen, it seems like I'm probably not empowered in that moment. You gave me that feedback on the show. And it's probably because I'm depleted. I don't have the self-care there. And so I'm overvaluing my preferences. I'm asking for certain things. And it's almost like it's a stopgap or a temporary play to try to get the needs met in a preferenced way. And so it sometimes can come off, I think, for myself and others, if I'm self-reflecting right now, it might look not selfish, but self-indulgent. It might look like it's a self-indulgent frame. And so as we're going through the world, it's hard to know, like, are we looking to self-care right now, or are we being very self-indulgent in this moment? And even self-indulgence might be, you're not getting your needs met. You don't have enough resource. You don't feel personally empowered. And so you're indulging to try to get to that peace, right? That's what you want. You want the self-empowerment. So you're using the self-indulgence to get there. So I think this is part of what's happening for some people in this, in this space, basically.
Well, and that's why it's so hard to figure out what your needs are, because it is really context dependent upon what's going on for you. Like you said, that this idea of like, I'm awesome. Like, I don't need to change. I'm an amazing person, and people should just recognize it. And I see a bit of this rhetoric, especially, and we'll do future podcasts on relationships and like, how do you get the relationship you want in a future podcast? But this idea of like, I'm so amazing, and I'm just waiting for my right partner to show up, because I'm looking for that amazing person that will fulfill me, who's already amazing. And I don't need to change. And if you see that attitude, you might automatically assume that person's like, they're not calibrated to what their needs are, right? Like they're there's some hubris there. But if that person is taking that mental stance as a fake it till you make it exercise to contrast a deflated ego or a time period where they thought they were a horrible person, and this is them conscientiously swinging the pendulum to the other side in order to taste the other side of what it would feel like to think you're amazing and awesome, and they're trying to do a massive, reframe or emotional shift to eventually balance out and address their ego. Because honestly, if you're doing ego work, the I'm a horrible human being is a worse frame to come from than I'm an awesome human being. I'm a horrible human being is a much more disempowered space to be than I'm an awesome human being. Now, I'm an awesome human being and everybody should bend to my will or acknowledge and validate how amazing I am and I don't need to make any changes. That's not an empowered frame either, but it's closer. And so a person might be attempting to get one step closer on their ego transcendence journey by allowing the pendulum to shift to the other side. And from the outside, it could appear as if the person's just being a dick or an asshole or self-aggrandizing. But for them as an individual, that might be meeting the need in the moment. And then you could see another person doing the exact same thing, and they're not conscientiously or thoughtfully going on a journey. That's actually overcompensation for them. They are not trying to get a need met, but they're trying to actually create some smoke and mirrors around how awful of a human being they won't acknowledge they are. They're trying to get some distance away from the thought that they might be broken or awful. And this is a strategy to never having to see that. And so in that case, that strategy is not serving them. So this exact same mentality and behavior and ways of showing up for one person might be a thought exercise. It might be something they're doing conscientiously as an attempt to be on a journey. And for another person, it's just a strategy to keep themselves from actually doing any work. From the outside, it's hard to tell, but because your level of thoughtfulness and conscientiousness around what's going on. So getting your needs met is something that is very personal, and it's something that requires you to be very honest with yourself. What actually are your needs? It's hard to say, these are the specific things you do to get your needs met because they will be tailored to your individual circumstances. But fundamentally, we all have basic human needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we've talked about in previous episodes gives a model for what those needs might be. But you are the only person who truly knows what they are. And I think the most important thing you can do is to calibrate to what those needs might be, to try to get really good at determining whether or not you are actually doing self-care with your thoughts and your emotional states and your physical, surroundings. You are the only person who really knows those things. So you have to get really intimate with what your needs truly are and then meet them, as opposed to go through a series of steps and hoping those things will do it. Now, sometimes if you've never done true self-care, if you've never really gotten your needs met, sometimes you have to take the suggestions of other people who are good at it and start implementing them until you build awareness around the muscle of it. I remember working out with a friend who was trying to, I think I've used this example before, but he was trying to exercise his oblique muscles, and the obliques are basically the muscle cluster, the muscles that run up and down your sides. And he was doing the series of exercises to build those muscles, but he couldn't even feel them. And I don't think it was until he hit his third or fourth time working out and doing that series of exercises that he went, oh my gosh, I can feel them. I can feel my obliques. So sometimes we just need to do behaviors so that we can start feeling, even what those needs might be. We don't know if we're compensating and creating smoke and mirrors around feeling like a terrible human being by over-aggrandizing who we are. We might not be able to know that until we do a series of exercises that helps us understand that, like maybe doing some meditations or some mindfulness or doing some exercises around getting, feedback from friends and family, or journaling, or, some of the things that are generally spoken about as getting your needs met on that level. So you might have to do some of those exercises before you start feeling it. But the goal isn't to just do those things. The goal is to get really sensitive to what your individual needs are and then be able to create a series of, specific exercise. I use the word exercises, not just to indicate physical exercises, but like journaling and those kinds of things. Disciplines is another word you could use, until you can find disciplines that are tailored to your individual experience.
So we tend to attract So you probably are attracted to this podcast as you're listening. Most likely you're a very aware person, and probably you're a very kind, decent person. And because you're aware and kind and decent, my suspicion is that you probably tend to focus on meeting the needs or the care of the people in your life that you love and care about. And you might just anticipate those needs that other people have. Maybe it's a spouse or children or family members, and you're meeting those for people. And I've seen this in my own life. That's why I'm addressing this, where you do this, you meet a lot of needs and you burn yourself out through it, right? You're busy, you're burning yourself out. And it's almost like there's a little bit of I shouldn't have to do self-care because the people in my life should recognize I've done this for them. Why is my spouse? I continually meet the needs of my spouse. And then the one time I'm tired, they should just know that I'm tired and I need needs met. Why are they like, I don't think I should have to do this. I shouldn't have to stop and say, I need some self-care here. I mean, I will, but man, it's so depressing. This is one-sided. I continually give to the people around me and no one else seems to pour into me. And I actually feel guilty if I take time for myself because I'm so interested in meeting needs around that taking for myself feels like I'm now not meeting needs again. Like I'm not meeting the needs of the people in my life. And so I have guilt around maybe taking time off to do the things that I need to pour back into my life. And I would say that, if you're listening and that's your experience, I can resonate with that. There's been moments in my life where that's happened and it's like, how come no one else seems to get this? And I would say that it still doesn't negate the fact that you're going to probably have to be the responsible party for that. No one else is going to do it for you. It's still going to have to come down to self-care is going to originate with you, and you can't outsource this. Maybe you're in a relationship where if you have a conversation with the person you're with or the people in your life, you can make them aware of this. Like, I really need some of my needs met too. And you can even articulate, like, I feel guilty if I take time for this, or I feel guilty around this. I want to work through it. And most people that love you are going to say, oh no, don't feel guilty. Please take the time you need. And if they are making you feel guilty about that, you might want to reevaluate that relationship or at least have a conversation around it in that relationship. But most people, I think, are supportive of that. But if you're expecting others to anticipate and to plan this for you or to help you with self-care or take the proaction for you, it's been my experience and my perspective that it really comes back down to you as a person to say, I am the responsible person for the self-care in my life. No one's going to necessarily give me permission to do that. I have to be the one to create that permission for myself and create the time, carve out the time for myself. It's not Antonia's responsibility to be tracking if I'm burned out around business and some projects we're working on. It's my responsibility to say, hey, can I go get a half hour of alone time? I've been working with the kids all day and we had this big project yesterday and I'm worn out. I know you've been doing the same, but right now I just really need that time. I need to go get some alone time, just check out for a few minutes. Can I get that? And she usually says yes. Mostly she says yes. But it's my responsibility to ask for that. I can't assume that she's going to be tracking my need and go, you know what, you should go get alone. Now she does. We've gotten in a relationship where she and I think, are sensitive to each other's needs. But often it's me that has to be the one to say, I think I need this time. And actually, I'm having to train myself that way. I'm more likely to suppress and just keep pushing through. So this has been something very personal for me to have to train myself around saying, wait a second, I think the reason I'm burned out is I need some space. I need to go attend to something in my life. I need self-care in this moment. So I just want to make that note about expecting others in your life to manage this for you. It's called self-care for a reason. You're the one that has to be the party that does this.
And as a reframe to that, there are people in our lives who might think that they're getting our needs met. They might be pouring into us and it's just not exactly what we need, so we're not feeling the effects of it, which shows that sometimes we do the same thing to another person, right? We pour into them and we think we're getting their needs met, but it wasn't exactly what they needed. And so this is why self-care is so required, is that people can pour into us, but we're really the only ones who truly know what's going on like I mentioned, on a subterranean level. Like, we can feel like we're pouring into others and they're a black hole of needs getting met. And that might be because we're not hitting the target directly on. It's kind of one of those things where if you are hungry after you've eaten, it means that there were nutrients your body required that were not represented in the meal you just ate. So your body's like, hey, thanks for giving me some calories, but what I really needed was some vitamin C, and you didn't give me any of that with those French fries, and so I'm actually still hungry. So if it feels like we're perpetually pouring into another person and the needs are never met, it's because we're not actually directly hitting those needs for them. And that's why self-care is so required, because fundamentally we're the best gauge of what the specific needs are that we have. And that means for the other person too. We have to at some point kind of dial back pouring into others, because we might be giving them calories that are not the calories they need. And so we're sating them to some extent, but we're not allowing them time and space to get the actual nutrients they require through their own self-care. Did that make any sense?
It did.
Okay, good.
Well, it made sense to me.
Okay.
I don't know about you listening. I'm sure it made sense to you listening too, but yeah.
Hopefully it did. So basically it kind of lets us off the hook to go, well, and they need to figure out what their nutrient is that their mind, body, spirit isn't getting, and allow them to do some self-care as well. It's not my job to constantly be feeding them without having the instrument of their own body to be able to determine whether or not I'm giving them the right quote unquote food or nutrients. So we all need self-care. And I think what's so powerful about Maslow's hierarchy is that it gives us a basis it kind of gives us a bit of a scale for what's going on. Most of us, when it comes to self-care, and the reason why we always talk, I mean, we mean like sort of like the personal development community, is constantly talking about things like alone time and yoga and meditation and mindfulness and all that stuff. Is that actually usually goes down to the physiological needs. Like, you're tired and your body is wearing out and your spirit is tired and it's wearing out. So make sure that you're addressing your physiological needs of getting plenty of rest, good nutrient dense foods, right? Like, make sure that piece is handled. But as soon as we get in a regime of making sure that we're honoring our body, we immediately start bumping up Maslow's hierarchy, and those needs get a little bit more tailored. Like, all bodies need fundamentally sleep, food, nutrition, homes, sex, like all the physiological needs that bodies have. But once we start going up Maslow's hierarchy, eventually, if you look at the model, you go from that to safety and security, which is like a house, and then love and belongingness, which are your relationships. And then on top of that is self-esteem, right? And so if you're into personal development and personal growth, oftentimes you've got those first three needs met and you're now in self-esteem. Well, what gets self-esteem needs met? That's very, very specific to you. Like, what will get your self-esteem needs met is pretty, zoomed in on you as an individual. And at the top of Maslow's hierarchy is self-actualization. And that's really targeted. Like, what are the obstructions to your own self-esteem and your own self-actualization is very specific to you as a person. So I think that's why I'm recommending that we get really good at knowing what our needs are, what the actual need is that we're attempting to meet with self-care. And for me, the exercise is always just asking myself, like, if I feel a draw to do something that seems to not be fitting into my schedule, alone time or reading, I have a major need to read on a regular basis that I neglected for a very long time because I didn't think I needed it, or I thought I could put it off, like kick the can down the road perpetually. I recently realized I have to read. Well, what's the actual need? The actual need is input. Why do I need input? Because I output a lot. So garbage in, garbage out, right? I'm going to get to a level where I can't output anymore if I'm not inputting. So what's the actual need? Well, my output is that I have an audience of people. Well, why do I have an audience of people? Because I think I have some stuff to say, right? Well, what's that meeting, right? What need is that meeting? Well, it's meeting my self-esteem needs. So just getting good at sort of asking why? What is the need? What is the need? What is the need? And getting very clear on it helps me recognize whether or not I'm being self-indulgent or whether or not I'm actually meeting a true legitimate need. And sometimes the way I want to go about it isn't the best strategy. So if I can get to the core of the need, I can find better strategies to meet them. Like, the need of hunger can be met with French fries, or it can be met with like a really nutritious kale salad. And if I don't get clear on that, I might just grab the French fries because it's easier or cheaper or more available, and I didn't really get the need met. So understanding that there are multiple strategies means if I'm moving towards a behavior and action to meet a need, and I find myself not actually meeting that need, then I need to pivot to a different strategy. For example, saying, well, I'm an awesome, amazing human being that doesn't need to change. That is a legitimate strategy for some needs. There are some needs that is the best thing you can be doing. And there are other needs where it's the worst thing you could be doing. It's like the French fries. It's not the kale salad. You could meet your need by not being indulgent in that way. So I feel like self-care is an easy topic at the surface, but underneath, if you're diving really deep into your growth process, it gets more nuanced. It gets more specific and targeted. And I think those of you on a personal development path or journey, I think eventually you'll hit this point where you recognize that it's not doing the same things that people keep telling you to do over and over and expecting different results, right? It's about getting very personally empowered with the actions you take and the strategies. Like you can start developing your own strategies to meet your needs. And you don't have to wait for other people's feedback to tell you whether or not it's the right thing. You get really good at figuring out whether or not you're being self-indulgent, right? If you're using smoke and mirrors to actually avoid something that's a need, like the need for self-esteem is based on like a healthy self-perception, but saying I'm amazing and awesome and I don't need to change and everybody else needs to change for me is not meeting that need. It might feel like it on the surface, but it's actually not. It's the work that meets that need. So getting really good at figuring out why you're doing what you're doing, whether or not your strategies are actually serving you, getting really in touch with what the needs actually are, like based on Maslow's hierarchy, using it as a scale for figuring that out. I think that's like the next level of really understanding the power of self-care.
And also paying attention to the things that hijack us getting our needs met, because on the surface, they feel like, and I'll just use a quick example to give you a sense of it, and then I think we can wrap up. You know, if you have the need of human connection, let's say, I'm not hanging out with friends enough. I need to connect with people more. Getting on social media, for example, or Facebook, it can simulate this feeling of connecting with others. You're making comments on people's walls and you're reading posts and you're posting things yourself and you're interacting with text and typing and connecting back and forth through a platform. But you're probably, and it might even synthetically get that hit for you. It might feel like you're getting the need met, but you ultimately, what is the fundamental need? It's actual human connection in real life. You can't just simulate it through social media, for example. Again, I'm not picking on social media. That's just a quick example that came to my mind. And so identifying where it is that you're using, like that's the French fry example, right? Where are you just filling the stopgap in the moment? You think you've met the need, but you fundamentally haven't. And that's where we're talking about is the self-care. What is the fundamental need underneath the surface? What is it that you're actually trying to meet? And the self-care is built around meeting those directly. And we want to hear from you. Now, this is, again, because it's so tailored and personal to you, based on your life, your circumstances, your age, where you are in life, all your stuff. When you come over to personalityhacker.com, you can make a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast. And we can start talking about this conversation here at personalityhacker.com, where we can hear from you and how you're applying some of these ideas in your life, some of the struggles you've had. Maybe you've got a story or something you'd like to tell us or work through the community and say, hey, I've got this need. I have no idea how to meet it. What do you guys recommend? And a lot of aware, smart, personal growth focused people can help chime in and we can work on these things together. So I encourage you to come over and make your voice heard.
Yeah. And particularly with this podcast, what I'd love to hear is how have people gotten more sensitive about what their true needs are? Like, what are the strategies you're employing? Is it journaling? Is it self-reflection? Is it awareness? Like, what are the specific, like, you're just sitting there thinking? Are you asking specific targeted questions? Like, what are the things you're doing to get more and more calibrated to the real needs that are living underneath all of this?
Yeah. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Thanks for joining us. The conversation about self-care and personal empowerment around self-care. We will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.